So this Friday, we're going to be able to go see an exhibition called Mater Dolorosa. I haven't seen it yet. I don't know what's in it, but I think there's going to be a lot of images. La Virgen de los Dolores, or in English, we might say the Virgin of Sorrows or the Lady of Sorrows. Sometimes she's called the Solitary One or La Soledad. There is so much to say about Mary, her iconographies and her histories, especially here in Mexico. And I'd be happy to talk about that some other time, but today I just want to help us be able to answer the question, is what I'm looking at a virgin of sorrow? Or if we put that in sort of fancy language, what are the salient features in this particular iconographic tradition? So I want to show you 15 or 20 examples of the Virgins of Sorrows, and I want to point out her distinguishing features. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to recognize a Virgen de los Dolores in the wild. And hopefully also you'll have some orientation points when you get to the exhibition. So in other words, like by orientation points, I mean like I hope that you'll be able to sort of do a mental compare contrast activity. So you'll be able to say, "Oh, I've seen something like that before," or "Oh, this is different than what I've seen before." The chief feature of La Virgen de los Dolores is her sad face. Typically, she's looking up or she's looking down. Pretty rare that her eyes are not looking up or down. And even though she may be beautiful, sometimes she looks very young, sometimes she looks very old, um, and her face is not often enriched. You can tell that she's sad, but yeah, her face is not bent out of shape. But usually there's something in her face that gives you a sense that this is someone who's suffering. It's relatively rare, even in artistic depictions of mourning, see tears in painting and sculpture and so on. But they're relatively frequent in Virgins of Sorrows. So that's something to look for. Most Virgins of Sorrows have their hands crossed, either across their chests or they have them clasped. Sometimes they're clasped in prayer. But as we'll see, there are exceptions. This is a 16th century painting from the workshop of Derek Boots. It's called The Mourning Virgin. And we can see here that her eyes are cast down, that her hands are clasped, here clasped in prayer. And we can see that her face is generally sorrowful, that she has tears both on her face and in her eyes. We can see the color of her eyes, that she's been likely crying for some time. This is Murillo's depiction of the Virgin of Sorrows, and we see that here that her eyes are lifted up as if she's looking for some relief from her suffering. And we see welling up in her right eye the beginnings of tears. Now I want to show you a couple of sculptures. The first is from the 17th or 18th century. It's colonial. We don't know if it's Mexico or Guatemala, but it's a nice 3D depiction. And again, here we see the hands are clasped. Here the eyes are looking up. Again, for relief, her face is clearly one of suffering. And the paint is relatively degraded, but it's possible that there were tears running down the right side of her face. The second one is 18th century example. This is done by a Spanish sculptor who was probably in the school of Jose de Mora. And we see here again, hands are clasped here against the chest. And the eyes, in a lot of these, the eyes are looking off to one side or another. I really like this one because they're straight up, and you really get that sense of begging for relief or a kind of hope for relief. You can see here, if we zoom in, that she has tears coming from both eyes. Now, there are at least two other iconographic traditions where we see Mary's suffering. And oftentimes, but not always, with this kind of sadness in her face and clasped hands and sometimes even tears. And so when you see these three features, you're not always looking at a Virgin of Sorrows. At this point, we can bring to mind the nickname La Soledad, or the solitary one. That will help us pick out when we're seeing the Virgin of Sorrows. And that's because these other two traditions, where we tend to see features like the ones I've been describing, are the Pietà, where you typically see the body of the dead Christ draped over Mary's lap, and the tradition of the Stabat Mater, where we typically see Mary depicted somewhere near the foot of the cross, typically standing, sometimes swooning. And so we can call to mind now the nickname of the Virgin of Sorrows, which is La Soledad, or the solitary one. And if we keep that in mind, then that will help us remember that if we see these features, but we also see Christ on the cross, or we see the dead Christ draped across Mary's lap, we know we're not looking at La Soledad or the Virgin of Sorrows. What we're seeing is a different iconographic tradition. Now, on the other hand, if you see the sad face of Mary, and you also see swords, or especially if they're directed at her heart, or if you see Mary surrounded by the scenes of the seven sorrows, in these cases you can be confident that you're looking at a Virgin of Sorrows. This is Albrecht Dürer's altarpiece with the seven sorrows of the Virgin. And here we can see the seven sorrows. So up in the upper left corner here, we can see the circumcision of Jesus. And moving down, we can see the flight into Egypt. Next, we see the episode where the family goes to Jerusalem and Jesus gets lost, but they find him later in the temple teaching the elders. Over here, we see Mary encountering Jesus on the Via Dolorosa. And then we see the crucifixion of Jesus and his descent from the cross, and finally his burial. And these are the seven sorrows. So, like I said, these seven sorrows are represented frequently by swords. And this is a reference to the second chapter of Luke, where Simeon prophesies that Jesus will suffer and that his mother will suffer also. So the famous line is, "Yea, a sword shall pierce through thy own soul also." So if you see a sad Mary and she's surrounded by seven swords, or if she is surrounded by these seven stories of her sorrows, you can be sure that you're looking at a Virgin of Sorrows. So let's take a look at this woodcut from the 15th century. This is in the Illustrated Barch, which is full of just delicious woodcuts. Here is the Mater Dolorosa, and you can see she has seven swords pointed at her heart. Has her face cast down, and I don't see her hands, but they're somewhere in there, clasped together. And I want to draw your attention to the hands in the top right and left corners, and the pierced feet at the bottom, and to this sort of amorphous shape that might be a heart at the pinnacle of this arc. That is how many artists depicted the hole in the side from the spear in Jesus' body. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes you'll just see this amorphous lump, and you figure out by the shape of the cut, which is usually this oval shape, as we see. You figure out by the shape of the cut that this is the hole in the side of the body of Christ. Now, you see also the crown of thorns that forms this arc around Mary. And we'll see this again later, but one of the interesting things about the Virgin of Sorrows is that her images are often paired with devotional practices where you're imagining the suffering of Mary, whose suffering is not her own, whose suffering is really caused by or the suffering of her child. And so it becomes a kind of this meditation on the suffering of others becomes a kind of not just a emotional exercise, but also an exercise in empathy and in connection to the connection of suffering to stories that are much greater than oneself. Now, I want to show you a couple of images where the swords and the stories of Mary's seven sorrows are both present. The first is from the Master of the Halflings. It is Spanish, and it's from the middle of the 16th century. And here we see something that we haven't seen before, which is this glowing light behind the Virgin. And we also see here the substitution of a single sword for the seven. But largely, this is an aside because I wanted to introduce you, if you don't already know his work, to Virix. Virix does a print that's clearly based off this, the Master of the Halflings. And his work is so Virix is part of a printmaking family, and many of his prints were they were sent over here on boats. It's a lot easier to send a print than it is to send a giant work of art, and though many of his prints became the models for scenes that you see in the ceilings and on the walls at Etotonilco, which was largely painted by a fellow called Bocasangre. So I wanted to draw your attention to that. So thank you for your attention during this geeky aside. Now we can move on. Let me show you just one more example first of the single sword that stands in for the other swords. So this is an example of the Milagro that Frida Kahlo's parents either made or commissioned after she had survived her accident with the trolley car. And here we see the Virgin of Sorrows up in the upper left corner. And we see here the heart is pronounced. She's got this face full of sorrow and the single sword. We also see some lilies, which we see, interestingly enough, paired with swords in the traditions of the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin, which is paired with the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But when you see the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin, you see the seven swords in her heart. Often you see lilies growing at the top, like you see here. And I think it's interesting because the devotional traditions of the Sacred Heart, like those of the Virgin of Sorrows, really have to do with meditation on the suffering of Christ or on the suffering of Mary. in that sort of empathic way, and in a way that connects to a larger story, like I was describing earlier. And this actually gets, you start to see this connection show up iconographically between the Sacred Heart and the Virgin of Sorrows, especially in the 20th century. But here's an example from the 18th. And now I want to show you four examples of the Virgin of Sorrows with this single sword. They're all from Mexican artists, although the last one was born Mexican and died a United States American because he lived during the land grab. Okay, so this first Virgen de los Dolores is from Nicholas Rodriguez Juarez. And it's in the National Museum of Art in Mexico City. And we see here the single sword. We see some flowers, just a great look at this background. Really beautiful design. But I want to draw your attention here to the nimbus, the beginnings of the crown tradition, and also to her face, which is just incredibly pallid. All right, this next one is also titled Our Lady of Sorrows, and it's from the same time period, around the middle of the 18th century. This one's in Museo Sumaya, also in Mexico City. And you have this lovely border of flowers. And we can see the sword has been decorated with a crucifix. And we also see the influence of the cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which at this time was really starting to gain traction both inside of Mexico City and outside of it. And we see that because of the stars on her cloak and also the particular way that her corona, the rays in her corona, are built, sort of echo the lines that you see in the Virgin of Guadalupe. This is a Virgin of Sorrows done by Nicholas Vargas. Again, around the same time period, and this one is much darker. As you can see, the sword is almost hidden in the darkness of the background, and the light really emphasizes her looking up gaze, and also the tear here on the under her right eye, and it also catches these clasped hands. This one appears to have captured the imagination of Jose de Gracia Gonzalez, who was a painter and a maker of bultos, or we might call them like statues of saints in northern New Mexico. And like I mentioned before, when he was born in Mexico, and in the course of his lifetime, became uh, a person from the United States of America. And we can see here in the clasped hands and the upward gaze that the Vargas is likely the model for the Gonzalez. Gonzalez as the nimbus. Now, while we're talking about folks from New Mexico. The next one I want to look at is by a guy called Felix Lopez. And he's still alive and he is working in northern New Mexico. He also creates bultos, and this is an example. The title is Nuestra Señora de los Dolores. And you see here, no swords, but we do see this extravagant crown. And I love how it echoes up here in the shell and again down here with the flower. We do see the clasped hands. And here the gaze is off in the distance and a little bit looking up, but it's not quite such a severe angle up or down as we see in many of the others. This is one of my favorites, and this is a work by Rodolfo Morales. He's a Mexican artist called La Virgen de la Soledad, which I love because she is not alone. Here she is surrounded by a couple of young women. We can see her crown, and we see that the crown is not affixed to her head. So her head can drape over in sadness while the crown keeps its place. And we see here she has a heart with the swords in it. And we have 7 flowers that surround it. Here she's an older woman, and I kind of like that. There's a nice contrast between the younger people around her and the Virgin. Down here we have ruby slippers and a dog, which makes this lots of fun. Morales worked primarily in painting, and he did some murals, but his collages are some of my favorite. So what we're working on here is this modern idea of crowns. And here's a postcard collage of Josef Albers. And he did this with images of La Soledad that he found in Oaxaca. And again, here we see the crown, and we see just an image that is much more elevated or royal than in some of these previous ones, with the delicate metalwork on this crown, and also the delicate embroidery work in her cloak. Here's an image of La Soledad by Jose Guadalupe Posada, who you may know as the sort of creator slash popularizer of La Catrina. It's one of his prints, and here again we see the crown. See this incredible pattern work. Here she's on a pedestal. Her hands are clasped. Her gaze is down. Actually, her eyes may or may not be closed. Could be that she's just looking down very, very hard. She may have closed eyes, and we see the heart. Looks to me like she may be holding a handkerchief, and this is something we'll continue to see in these images of the Virgin. Okay, so this is in this last section. Wikipedia actually has a whole group of pictures of images of La Virgen de los Dolores and also Las Soledades. And so I've just chosen a few to give you the kind of flavor of this. these are virgins that are used in churches, and so it's a little different viewpoint than we have seen with some of these previous images. So, yeah. So here I just want to point out, yeah, she's got the crown again. This is something we'll see many, many times. You see the heart with the swords, and again the handkerchief. Here she's in black, which is the color of mourning. I haven't talked about this yet, but many times with Virgin of Sorrows, we see her in black. Whereas typically, like if you want to say, oh, that's for sure Mary, you're looking for someone with like a red shirt and a blue cloak. Those are the colors that you're typically looking for. But we see a wider variety here and a lot of use of black because obviously it's the color of mourning. This one's beautiful, and it is from Playa del Carmen. And we see here the huge crown, in addition to the crown of thorns and the handkerchief in her hands. See the sword, and we can also see this very troubled look on her face and a tear coming now from her left eye. It's kind of remarkable, this one. Her mouth is open, and it's something that people do when they are overwhelmed or taken by surprise. And finally, this is the Virgin of Sorrows that is in La Compañía. And you can see, well, let me zoom in here. You can see that she's got her sword and a handkerchief and a large crown. And if we zoom in even farther, we can see how prominent those tears are and how much suffering is visible in her eyes. The eyebrows really do a lot of work there. It's really incredible, the amount of emotion that the sculptor is able to portray here. So that about wraps it up, and I hope that you will take away from this, a little bit of context or ability to compare contrast when we see this exhibition of the Mater Dolorosa. And that when you're out and about in a museum or in a church or just you see a procession going by when you're on the street, you'll be able to identify the Virgin of Sorrows.